Hey guys, it's Micah. Welcome to another Philosophical Tuesday. We're glad you could join us. In today's podcast, we dive further into the religion versus science debate. We primarily focus on epistemology, the theory of knowledge. We expound upon Hume's problem of induction, introduce Locke's concept of probability, and further explore the relationship between science and fact, and religion and value. Thank you for listening. As always, we hope you enjoy this conversation. Welcome to another Philosophical Tuesday. I'm here with both Joshes, but today, the preeminent Josh, that is the one who is first and foremost, is Josh Smith.
Ayo. I think it's my first time being the preeminent Josh, and it feels,
That's not true.
I have to say it feels really great.
That's not true.
Well,
don't lie.
It's not my first time going first, but it's the first time that you've dubbed me the preeminent one, and I'm going to go
It's
with
the first time I've done either of you the preeminent one. Now that's a temporary position, I'll have you know, so it could change.
Well, now I'm kind of bummed out, but whatever. So I'm Josh, and I'm here today with my good friend Josh Charlton.
Hi, Josh. Today I will allow you to be
Hi, Josh.
preeminent, Josh. And give you your spot in the spotlight as the blazing Josh of choice.
Ooh, I see what you did there. Spot in the spotlight, blazing. Very nice.
Yeah. I like a little poetry in my language, you know. I'm here with our not nearly as acceptable today. And his hair is not as spoofy as it usually is, which I'm kind of disappointed by, because I usually like his hair, but today it's just a little bit it's subpar.
I actually had left my chair to go and fix it for you, Josh.
I mean, it does look better than it did like 10 minutes ago, so I'll give you that. Wait, so when
I
you were
haven't
going
moved in the
when you
past
were
10
going to the
minutes.
bathroom, you weren't actually going to pee, you were going to fix your hair so that I would like you better?
No, I didn't fix my hair so that you would like me better. I fixed my hair so I would like me better.
Only because I commented on the fact that I didn't like your hair today. So
No. We hopped on the call and you said something about my hair. I said something about my hair being, out of sorts.
but I wasn't going to
And then
say
I said,
anything until you started
Well, and then I stepped away to go fix it, and you didn't notice, and now I'm kind of upset.
Is this
I mean,
episode
it
about
does look
Micah's
better.
insecurities?
It does look better. It's definitely not as spiffy as it usually is, but
Spiffy.
it's better.
Oh, I thought you said poofy.
I said spiffy.
Oh, spiffy.
I think I have said poofy before though, so both.
I mean, it does get kind of poofy a little bit.
But it's not just poofy because it's got spiff to it too. You know what I mean? It's got volume and form.
Ooh.
Today it doesn't really have either of those things. Although it's not quite as wild as it was earlier. So it is now acceptable. As was this intro, kind of. Your last 7 attempts weren't so great. But,
7, yes. 7 attempts I made. After I told you guys 7 times to shut up so we could start recording the podcast. Oh, man.
Well, at least a few of those you botched, so it's not all our fault.
Yes, I botched 2 of them. I will grant that. Anyway, so now that you all could join us for our, meandering that we've been doing for the past 45 minutes, today we're going to be resuming our discussion, picking up sort of where we left off last week on the idea of science versus religion, more specifically scientific materialism versus religion, and how science has tried to sort of take on this religious aspect to it over the past 200 years or so. I know Josh Smith was going to open up with some sort of a little bit of a summary of some of the things we talked about last week and maybe a few counterpoints. So Josh is going to summarize and we'll start from there.
Thanks, Micah. So yeah, to whoever's listening, we had an episode last week where we talked about religion and science and the presumed dichotomy between the two. We tend to, at least in our modern conceptions, tend to think of religion as being within the realm of subjectivity, something that's a personal decision, but that doesn't really have a founding in something more objective. What we have come to deem as objective in the modern world of let's say materialism is anything that falls within the realm of the science. Now, we kind of started off our discussion last week by defining what science was, because there's basically two different schools of thought. There's the realist view, which tends to look at science as the approximations of certain truth about reality. Then the other view of science looks at it's called instrumentalism, and it tends to look at science as primarily a process that is intended to be objective, but that is ultimately governed by humans. And so in that sense, it's not perfect. So then we kind of got into Josh's synthesis of Hume's arguments. Now, to the best, I'm going to try to summarize these arguments back at you guys, okay? And Josh, you basically respond to whatever things I bring up about Hume's argument that you disagree with. Just point out if I'm kind of characterizing the argument correctly. So, the basic concept that we looked at through Hume last week was knowledge. And Hume basically lines out two different kinds of knowledge that we can have as humans. One is analytical knowledge. And within analytical knowledge, the concepts rest on each other by definition. So the realm of mathematics would be an instance of this. 2 plus 2 is 4. That is by definition true. And actually, within when we're using analytical knowledge, in any conceivable reality, this thing would be true, because it's just true by definition. Now, the other type of knowledge that Hume talks about is synthetic knowledge. Now, synthetic knowledge is not known by definition, it's known by evidence. And rather than being a priori, it's a posteriori, which means that it's known through experience rather than known by concept. So you actually need to experience it, according to Hume, in the world to be able to know that it's true. And Hume's basic argument about synthetic knowledge is that basically all things that are not definitional are synthetic in their nature. So if I'm conducting science experiments, I'm a human conducting those. And the process that I'm building might grant me some form of surety in their accuracy, but in no way can I claim to have pure knowledge and claim these things to be facts about the world. I also believe that Hume he used that argument that Josh used last week of the sun, right? How do we know that the sun is going to rise tomorrow? Well, because it has it's risen every single day of my life so far. And not only that, but sources of authority that I trust have told me that it's risen every single day throughout the history of mankind. Even further than that, the field of science has tried to come up with a pretty solid theory as to why the sun rotates or the rotation of the different planets and the axes and all that, to basically understand why the sun sets and rises. So basically the point is, when it comes to scientific experiences, there doesn't seem to be a good reason as to why we should claim those to be so objective, but claim let's say a personal encounter with God. If I have a personal encounter with God, that to me has been experienced. So what is the huge difference there? Josh, do you think that's the solid direction we were heading in, or?
It's almost a flawless explanation. The one thing that I would just and I just don't want to. This is kind of in there, but it's not. I don't know that it was explicit in what you just said. So the idea, the underlying reason as to why it is you can't claim knowledge as to things that are built upon experience is because the justification for experience being a valid tool to be used to claim, basically it's a predictor of future events, so that the argument for why it is that experience can be a valid measure of gaining knowledge is that our experience has dictated to us that that is true. And so the one part that you missed in there was this circular, the kind of underlying reason why it is that it's actually fundamentally illogical to say that you could use experience to claim knowledge is because the only justification for why experience could be used to claim knowledge is that our experience has dictated to us in the past that our experience is a legitimate tool to be used to predict future events, which is circular reasoning. And that's the only part that I think you missed in that. And that just can't be glossed over because that's kind of the core of his point. And I think that was the only thing I noticed. The only other thing that you were talking about when you go back to that idea of definitional knowledge, it was phrased. I liked your phraseology for the most part. I would just further specify that the reason that it's definitionally true because we define it that way. So it's not that the definitions themselves are necessarily like, we talk about like 2 + 2 = 4, and it's like people might argue that that is subjective because, it's language and it's messy. I'm not talking about like the underlying kind of mathematical truths necessarily. We're talking about our definitions. In other words, the logical confines of the language itself define two in such a way that define 2 and add and 2 and equals and 4 in such a way. We define all of those things in such a way that that 2 + 2 necessarily equals 4.
Right. So it's the same thing. It's just they're contingent truths. So they're contingent upon the definitions being such.
Exactly. And you can't work your way around that. And that's kind of and so that's that's the only further specification. And you didn't contradict that. It just wasn't. I just wanted to specify to make sure that was a clearly understood concept. But other than that, I thought it was a phenomenal summation.
Where do you think the answer is in searching for knowledge then? How are we to obtain reliable answers as to what the truth is when we're trying to seek out knowledge about the universe, let's say?
And this is something it's an excellent question. This is something I've wrestled a lot with. I don't have a good answer to this because I don't know that there is a way. I haven't found a way based on these particular definitions to find a reliable kind of third way of acclimating knowledge that isn't contained within the two that Hume has already laid out. So I think that there are some things. I think there are some things that we could reasonably say that we could reasonably claim knowledge of them not being true because they contradict that kind of analytical definitional truth that we were talking about. So if you have constructed for yourself a worldview that is inherently contradictory, and as in you define things in such a way that logically they necessarily contradict with one another, and lots of people do that. They'll hold separate contradictory ideas in their minds simultaneously, and they'll call it a worldview, but it's logically inconsistent. Because that is not as I can lay out for you on paper using basical. I can
that
lay
was
out.
A goof.
Yeah. I can lay out for you on paper using basic logical, logical proofs that a contradictory worldview, if the things in that worldview by definition contradict one another. And we can say with certainty that we can claim knowledge over definitional truths because why are definitional truths true? Because we define them to be true that way. That meets our own definitions. And so if we construct if somebody has a contradictory worldview that repeatedly contradicts itself, we can reasonably claim knowledge. I know that worldview that you have constructed for yourself is at least not wholly correct. Not that necessarily all individual elements of that worldview could we claim knowledge as to whether they are, as individual units, are correct or not, but that the whole, because it is self-contradictory, we can eliminate that as being something that we could claim. We could say with certainty that we know that to be not the case. So that's at least a start.
Yeah, is there much practical value to that though? Because, I mean,
well, yes,
it would be hard to really. I mean, you could look at somebody says something contradictory, and you could say, well, that's contradictory. What you believe is wrong. It's contradictory. But, I mean, maybe you have different definitions of what they're saying. Maybe they're not defining things consistently. And I mean, in that case, it's an inconsistency, but it doesn't mean they're wrong.
So it may be the definitional inconsistencies may be, rather than definitional inconsistencies, linguistic inconsistencies, which is kind of a separate thing. So if it's a matter of if the difference is not in the underlying definitions contradicting each other, but in a difference in how we're actually defining things. And so if you're defining if you're using the same words that I am, but you're using separate definitions, and my definitions of those words would indicate that the construct that you have created with those words is contradictory, but yours do not, we have a difference in our linguistical understanding of what was just being said, not in the actual underlying contradictions of the definition, which is a distinction that we need to make. But there are instances in which the definitions, the underlying ideas of those words do in fact provably counteract one another. They are actually contradictory. And in those situations, we could rightfully say that, okay, we can claim knowledge that something is at least off there, that those two things can't be held at once. Or they could be held at once, but holding them simultaneously is wrong. It's incorrect. One of those things can't be right. Maybe neither of them are right, but at least one of those things has to be wrong. And that is at least a starting point. So that's one thing that, can help us to kind of narrow the mark a little bit. And really what I've kind of, how do we find truth? Can we know truth? I would put forward that due to our limitations as human beings, knowing truth beyond what we've just established in a very kind of absolute, final, complete way is impossible. I really don't believe that based on the definitions that we've laid forth, based on Hume's argument, that you can make a compelling case that an individual could ever claim to have knowledge of a kind of they can obviously of the things that we've laid out that we know that we can claim knowledge of, but beyond those things, anything that they're basing anything that they are claiming that is based on their own experience to claim knowledge over, because there really is no way out of that logical loop, you can't claim knowledge of it. You can only claim belief. And I don't think that there's a reliable way to claim. I don't think there is a reliable way that you could another way to claim knowledge of those things. Now, another thing that Hume makes the case for, and this is, I think, kind of where our hope lies. And Hume makes the case basically the fact that we can't claim knowledge over one belief or the other doesn't mean that it is that one belief isn't true or the other one isn't true. It doesn't mean that one of them isn't better and another one worse. But those are kind of different things than it's a little bit different to claim knowledge over a belief that something is better, that a belief is better or worse than one another, or closer to the truth than another, than it is to claim knowledge over those things. How it is that we approximate which of those things is better or worse is a muddy process. What I kind of outlined of that idea of certain things that we could at least claim knowledge don't exist, that are contradictory, is a way that we may help to narrow the mark. So I think our hope lies in, if we're going to attempt to construct for ourselves, say our goal in this is to construct a worldview for ourselves that are going to help orient ourselves in the world, because everybody needs one of those. Let's say that's our end point. That's what we're trying to achieve. And we're trying to find a reliable way to find for ourselves a worldview that approximates the true reality, the true perception of the absolute. And that's our goal. Maybe it's not, but I'm posing that as our. Do we think that's a goal that we can agree on just for the sake of this argument?
Let's agree with that.
Well,
this is purely for the sake
state
of
it one more time for me.
Let's say we're attempting to find. Let's say our problem, the problem that we're trying to solve. We're trying to find an answer to a problem, and our problem is the thing that we're trying to approximate is a worldview that is as close as we can figure in our narrow perspectives to that which properly matches the underlying absolute reality that exists beyond our perception of it.
I would actually state that we're not necessarily trying to find that worldview. We're trying to find more specifically a way to get there.
Well, right. I'm not saying we are trying. What I'm doing is giving us a target. I'm giving us a target for the sake of the argument. I'm not saying that is. I understand what we're trying to do, but I'm giving us a target we can aim for the sake of the conversation, so that we can provide examples as to how we would work towards that.
And
does that
just
make sense?
For a point of clarification, referring back to something you argued, Micah, in one of our earlier podcasts, this is not to identify the perfect worldview out there in the ether and then subject ourselves to it. This is to try to understand what the truth is and then to build our worldview on that. But the goal is to try to work towards that.
The only reason I'm giving us that goal is so that we can have a journey that works towards it. I'm putting a target in front of us so that we can outline our journey to get to that point. Because that's that. If our goal was to find knowledge of the truth, I'm giving us a truth that we're trying to claim knowledge over, and I'm positing a theoretical journey that we could take to move toward it, so that we can begin our attempts to. We can start talking about how it is that we're going to go about orchestrating that journey, because the goal of the conversation is the journey, not the end point, right? So
sure. Do you mind if I bring up a little bit of I think it's kind of a segue, but it's also a response to some things you claimed in the past podcast.
Yeah, yeah.
So Locke had this idea of justified true belief. So it's the idea that, kind of in accordance with Hume, knowledge is not something that the knowledge gained through experience is not something that we can have absolute certainty of and call it truth. Locke argued that the way in which we come to know things is through experience. He defined things a little bit different than Hume, but it was pretty much similar, like sensations, experience, and you could gain a belief in the things that you thought were true. Now, what Locke argued was justified true belief. So the level of belief that you held in something should be based on the level of evidence you had for that thing being true. So it was kind of an empiricist worldview. But the idea was, if we cannot know anything, the best surety we can have of following the truth is to like, let's say, using the scientific method, conduct these unbiased experiments, assuming that can be done, in order to be able to build up this system of beliefs that we can follow, and conduct ourselves in that manner. So kind of in Lockean fashion, there's the idea of probability, right? Probability is a basis for belief, even if it does not prove that this thing is 100% true and that you can have sure knowledge of it. The question remains, should belief be based on how high the probability is of that thing being true? And should evidence be the main dictate to be able to determine that?
Well, right. So I think that's a really, first of all, that was an excellent summation of those particular arguments. So thank you for that. So right. So I think there's, so to make sure that we're framing the conversation properly, I think that we have to recognize that whatever we're moving forward from here falls purely in the realm of belief. Right?
Mm-hmm. Experience even more.
And we're really trying to determine, right? We're trying to determine why you should believe something.
Right.
Rather than another thing. So yes, we're in the realm of belief, but we're in the realm of value.
Right. So how do you determine what belief? So that's just okay. So yes, I think that the idea that experience is a using previous experience to predict future events or predict the accuracy of those future events is if you accept that to be, if we start with the belief that is a valid presupposition, then that is a very good guiding principle, and our experience would tell us that it is a very good guiding principle because our experience tells us that our experience is correct. It's a different thing than saying that I have knowledge of that. But if we're operating purely within the realm of the belief, then, well, our experience has told us that it's a reasonable presupposition that if I drop this glass cup on the floor, it's going to shatter because I've dropped glass cups on the floor before and they've shattered. And so the idea that is a more reasonable belief than that I will drop this and it will float up to the ceiling, I think is a reasonable statement within the confines of that, which is a different thing than claiming knowledge over it. So that's an important thing to distinguish. But once we're operating in the realm of the belief, that is, I think, one very, and it's difficult to use the word good here, but it is good in the sense that our experience has revealed to us that it is good. It's been a valuable tool that we have found individual value in our own individual lives. Now that doesn't mean, however, that it is the only metric that should or ought to matter in determining whether or not something is one belief is better or worse than the other. And the main reason I think for that, for why it is that maybe we shouldn't say that that's the only or even the best metric, is that if we're talking about experience, statistics, science, which is where that kind of fundamental argument lies, the methods by which we derive future predictions from those analyses are intentionally designed with the intent of removing value from the equation. So, for example, and I think we talked about this before the podcast, bringing this up towards the end, but I think this has now become relevant to the conversation, so I think it's worth inserting at this point. Some of the worst atrocities in human history were done with the justification that they were to further scientific process. So the horrifying experiments that were done by the Nazis to the Jews in concentration camps, it was at least claimed that those experiments were done with the intent of furthering of it was a brutal, horrifying way to rapidly advance scientific understanding of the human body and of the human psyche. That we could perform these experiments, and that would allow us to make all kinds of new advances in medical treatment and in medical technology that would ultimately save lives and advance the human race. If we limit ourselves to the principle that Josh just outlined, that kind of Lockean principle of evidence and really the kind of the scientific method as being the sole guider and the most important guider, it's very difficult to justify why exactly it is what they were doing was wrong. Because if you begin with the presupposition that everything merely, if we remove say value from that equation and focus purely on kind of scientific evidence or statistical evidence as a guide for determining which belief is better or worse than the other, well, better or worse is a value statement. It's again the methods that we use purposefully remove that, and so it's very
more
difficult.
Accurate.
Well, but even you might say that, I suppose, but again, even that that is fine in if you want to determine what the weather is next Thursday, that's fine, but that's not going to help you determine whether or not what the Nazis were doing in the concentration camps was horrific or not, because that's not the science makes no claim as to that.
So these would be
so
moral,
that's, I guess,
these would be moral beliefs that we would develop in response to the conduction of the scientific method, rather
but by completely different means, right? And I guess that's the point, is that in certain areas, what it is that you just talked about, that kind of scientific approach to things, I think makes a great deal of sense, right? If you want to determine, if your goal is to determine what the weather is next Saturday, that approach makes a lot of sense, because you don't need to input value claims into what the weather is next Thursday. You just need to know what the weather is next Thursday. If your goal is to define a system
you're
of
basing
morality,
that on the fact that within the confines of your presuppositions, it doesn't seem to matter. Let's say something else, like, right, if I'm a traditional religious person who believes that my crop yields are the result of me praying to the gods and offering them sacrifices every August. Would we then be able to make the claim, no, we are pretty confident that that you offering burnt sacrifices and praying to your God has nothing to do with the fact that you're getting crops or not?
Well, I think that, I mean, it's a little, that's I suppose so. I mean, it's a little bit of a tricky.
I'm trying to bring us into the religious realm, and I don't know how to do that best.
Well,
it's not. Mike is. What was Mike?
Two thoughts. So I'm gonna actually start with the more recent thing you said, then work backwards. So the first something that occurred to me when you were talking about using the examples of experiments on that Nazis did on Jews, or that the Soviets did on their people, or that the United States did on our people, back in the 20th century. We can say back now because it's been we can say back now because it's been 20 years. So it's possible to say that there has been a lot done that has been in disregard of specific values that we might consider moral or ethical values, in favor of exercising the scientific method with fewer restrictions. However, that does not imply a failure of the scientific method to institute those same restrictions. Now, we can have that conversation, but the argument is not whether the scientific method should be, or the probabilistic method, the method of exploring what is the most likely thing. We can believe that that is a good thing without doing that unbounded. We can try and use that same system if we want to. I'm not saying we should, but if we wanted to, we could try and use that same system to develop a means of determining what the bounds should be around scientific inquiry. So I don't think that it necessarily... Now, there are some times where the removal of value from the scientific method does become problematic. I mean, if you're experimenting on people, it's pretty hard to experiment on people because our system of ethics says you have to let them know that you're experimenting on them, and then they immediately change the way they're behaving because you're experimenting on them. They know they're being experimented on. So, there's sorts to... That's where I think that's a limitation to the method. The other thing I want... Go ahead and respond to that.
My response to that is, and I think that I half agree with what you just said. The issue, and I think kind of where I was getting what my underlying point was that if you tried to, let's say you wanted, and this is maybe the fundamental failure of the kind of evidence-based method, even in finding value. It's not. My case was not merely that in that individual instance, science wasn't making claim to morality, which is true, and that's obviously true. But rather that science and that whole method can't actually do that. And so the idea that we could, I don't think it's possible to take that method and apply it towards finding values for a very simple reason. And I'll give you an example of this. Let's say I want to determine whether or not I want to use that particular method to determine whether or not what's a nice thing you could do for somebody? Give them
a piece of ice cream.
Give them a piece of ice cream. Okay, yeah, sure. I want to use that particular method to determine whether...
What's a piece of ice cream?
I was going to say cake, but then I changed it to ice cream.
Sorry, continue, Charlton. I'm sorry.
I want to use that method to determine whether or not giving somebody a piece of ice cream is a good thing or not, or is a good thing or not. The issue is that I haven't actually defined what good is, and it gives me no method to determine what good is. So I can go and I can run the experiment, and I can give ice cream to 100 people, and I can see their reactions and judge for myself, and I'll see that 99 of them were really, really happy with that, and really, really, and they came up and gave me a high five and a hug, and one of them turned around and looked at me and said, "Why the heck are you handing me a piece of ice cream? You didn't even give me a plate to hold it in. It doesn't even have a cone. It's just a raw scoop of ice cream that you just dumped into my hand. What's wrong with you, you psycho?" Science gives me no method of determining that one of those reactions was better than the other, because it doesn't define what better is. It can't tell me what better is. It can only gather the statistical data, and I have to derive the patterns out of it. But there's no way that I can conceive of to based on all of those various experiences. Some of them may make me feel better than the others, but even that, saying that, well, they made me feel better, that's not the same thing as them being good or not. It's not really a value judgment. It's an observation in myself. But why is it good that I should feel better as opposed to feel worse? There's no real indication that science can give me that one of those things is better or worse than the other. One of the states is better or worse than the other, or more natural or more desirable. They have to give me no indication of that. So the issue is that the underlying method of science or statistical analysis or experience-based predictions or whatever it is you want to call it, it's all the same thing. It precludes value judgment. There is no value judgment in that. And so my actual case is that not only am I saying that it doesn't include value judgment in that particular situation, but that it can't even be used to determine what the value judgments are or should be to begin with. Mm-hmm. Then that's what I would say about that.
Well,
but I do want to,
and what you said is related to my other point, which was that I mean, we talk about using probability to determine, and maybe this is more directed to you, Josh Smith. We talk about the idea of using probability to determine truth. That's correct? It's the idea of using probability to
determine what you should believe in.
To determine what I should believe in. Okay, right, because we're talking about belief now, strictly. Part of the difficulty is how you define what is probable. It's not probability in a mathematical sense. Because for it to be probability in a mathematical sense, I mean, we can kind of go back to the Hume thing here. It has to be definitional. You have to actually define what your measure of a possibility is, and what your measurement of the outcome is. So if I'm going to flip a coin, I need to say it can either land on its head or its tail, and then I need to say, well, it did that or it did that. So on one hand, you have to start defining things. And maybe we can accept that. Maybe we can accept that we're going to define things based on our experiences of the world around us. But it becomes, at the very least, it becomes very difficult to say that one thing is more probable than another. And even then, what do you mean by probable?
Well, all probability means, and this is the answer to that, because we define probability this way. What probability very simply means is how many times have I experienced something happening versus how many times have I not. That is all that it means. If I drop a ball 1,000 times and I measure it, how many times did I drop the ball that I experience it falling down versus how many times did I not experience it falling down? And then we define probability in exactly those terms. And if you try to bring probability outside of that particular context, it doesn't work, because we created probability as a concept to explain exactly that.
I'm not sure, though, that's what... Josh, is that what you meant by probability strictly?
Well, that's generally how probability is defined. Like
in a scientific sense.
Yeah, as a scientific.
I guess
you use the example of a coin, right? So if I throw a coin up and it falls back down, and I do that a bunch of times, so there's the idea of causation and correlation, right? Does me throwing the coin up in the air have anything to do with it falling back down and landing in my hand? Well,
probability as a physical reality doesn't exist,
right?
Because if you throw the coin 100 times, you could, if you understood all of the natural, there is no probability. The coin is 100% going to land on the side that it's going to land on every time that you throw it.
Right.
You just by your limited perception don't have the facilities to measure all of the natural forces that are at play and in real time calculate which side it is 100% going to land on. All probability tells you is exactly what I just outlined, which is the ratio of your past experiences. That's all that it is. That's how we defined it.
I guess what I'm trying to get at is I don't think that that definition of probability is even remotely useful for trying to determine what I should or shouldn't believe. I mean,
no, it's not. That's my
I can do an experiment and based on my experiment predict something, say that there's a probability of X of one thing happening or another thing happening, and these are the different probabilities. What I struggle with is the idea that I could say let's use the phrase, what is the probability that God exists?
Oh boy.
That's a stupid statement.
I agree. But, however, it depends on what belief it is you're trying to presuppose. So I think I said earlier, if you're trying to use these methods to determine, say, what the likelihood that, well, we'll go back to the sun rising example, right? We already established that you can't claim knowledge as to whether or not the sun will rise tomorrow. If we're going to talk in terms of the probability, how I should determine to live my life should I live my life as though the sun is going to rise tomorrow, or as if a giant sack of turnips is going to rise tomorrow? Well, if somebody actually went around believing that a giant sack of turnips was going to rise tomorrow morning in the sky as opposed to a giant sack of turnips, and they actually believed that, we would call that person insane. That's probability at work in a valuable sense, determining what it is you should and shouldn't believe. But it's confined to a particular subset of reality. We're not talking about the realm of value. We're talking about the realm of the physical. If we're trying to use probability to determine what the probability is that it's going to rain tomorrow, or what it is the probability that, again, the sun will rise tomorrow, or what it is the probability that, pick your physical thing. That can be, I think, a legitimate, valuable tool that we use in our day-to-day life to determine how it is that we ought to operate our daily life. And I think that our experience has given us the evidence of that. That's a different thing than trying to prove God's existence with probability.
No, and I'm not. Here's what I'm trying to do. I think there is a definitional problem here. I agree with your definition of probability as a mathematical / scientific method sort of phenomenon. I understand that is. We can define that sort of probability, but there is a difference between saying something has this probability, between something is probable in a scientific or a mathematical sense, and trying to look at different ideas and weigh them and say which one of these is the more probable representation of reality. It's not trying to make
right.
That's what I was trying to pull out of what you were saying, Smith.
So this is kind of the distinction between the how and the why. If we're going to look at science as a process for explaining the world, then we're looking at it to tell us how the world works. We're not looking at it to figure out why the world works that way. That's why it's impossible to answer the question as to whether God exists in this probabilistic sense. That's why it's impossible to answer the dilemma of the whole, like, God sending the rain for the crops and all that, because that's asking the why. What we're looking at simply is the how.
I guess that my issue with using probability in that context is I defined probability in the context of the material. If you can provide for me a definition for probability in the sense of what is the probability that God exists, and you can define for me what you mean by probability in that sense, I will cede the point. But I don't think that you can.
No, and so maybe I can't.
I don't think that probability has any. I don't think that there is a definition for probability in the sense that we use that word in any real context, unless you're talking about a different word. But if you're trying to talk about probability, what is the probability that God exists? My only answer to that is, well, you can't. There is no probability that God doesn't exist, because there's no experience. There's no. Unless you're talking about something completely different. But again, it's at that point we need another word. Because we're no longer talking about.
Then likely. Let's use the word likely. I'm not. What I'm trying to do is I'm
likely
trying
is based on experience, right? Like that's the same. You're talking about the same thing, right? You're talking about what is my based on. We're trying to use now an experience-based argument to justify a value claim, and I don't see how it is that. I don't see how it is that we can do that.
We can't use an experience-based argument to justify a value claim.
Yeah.
Then, okay.
That's what we just outlined in the last few discussions, right?
Well, I think we outlined that we can't... It depends on what you mean by experience-based, because how could you determine anything if you don't in some way experience it? I mean, if somebody doesn't tell you, hey, this is how it is... If you don't have any intake of information, which is by definition what an experience is, if you don't have any intake of information, you couldn't think, let alone, you wouldn't have developed the ability to think, let alone determine anything about what is a better thing, is a better belief. So I don't think we can say, I think we can say that yes, conducting an experiment of what is the most likely thing to happen in terms of events. I understand that. Yes, in terms of events, we can't use a methodology designed to predict events to determine truths, but we can use the term probability when Josh explained the Lockean idea of trying to determine things that are most likely to be true. And maybe we should use that term instead of most probable, most likely to be true.
Those are synonyms.
Okay. Well, if we're going to try and look at the world around us and reason our way through our existence and say, this thing, maybe we'll say, makes more sense than this thing over here. That's different than probability. I understand that. But it's not a measure of events, it's a measure of ideas. It's a measure of value.
Yeah, but that is a different thing than probability.
And that's exactly the reason why, as I just pointed out, that we can't answer that with the probability argument, because the probability is based on the material, it's based on the experience, whereas when it comes to the value, that's a whole nother realm.
But I don't think that's what Locke was saying.
That is what Locke was. Well, no, that's not what Locke was saying, but that's not the case that we're making. We're making the point that the case that Locke was making is insufficient for dealing with the realm of the value, which has been the case.
So you really think that Locke believed that we could just go around assigning exact probabilities to whether or not something would happen, or it is true?
I was saying that particular argument that Locke was making, that Josh outlined, the idea that probability, or the analysis of probability, ought to be the metric for determining which belief was better or worse than the other, falls short because it doesn't allow us to define better or worse.
I'll agree with that.
I think you might just be making it more complicated in your head.
I think
maybe I probably am. I guess I've never been thinking throughout this conversation. I haven't been thinking exclusively in terms of measurable.
I mean, I don't know how else to interpret it when he says the evidence should be the way in which we define our belief in the truth. Like, what else is evidence other than what you can.
Well, probability is definitely not the right word to use then.
Well, that's his term.
His term is probability of what?
Of experience, evidence, probability of whatever. It's what probability of pick your poison. It's probability that the sun will rise tomorrow. How many times we've already had this conversation.
Well, I think that was Hume's term actually, rather than Locke's.
But it's the same. But it's the same thing. Probability. Yeah. Probability exists within the realm of the experience. Evidence exists within the realm of the experience. What are we talking about when we talk about evidence? Well, we're talking about the culmination of our past experiences. That's what evidence is.
Yeah.
I don't know. I don't quite understand what the issue is here, because I don't know that we're actually disagreeing on any of this. I just think that I think Josh is right. This is overcomplicating things.
I think I'm stuck on something, and I'm not quite sure what it is. So
let's just proceed with the conversation and see where it goes.
I think,
Josh, I did have a couple points to bring up from last conversation. So you made 3 different claims that I caught in the course of the conversations, most of which we've kind of already gone over.
You really were keeping notes. I'm impressed.
Yeah. So, well, I mean, these are pretty basic points, but one claim you made near the beginning of our last conversation was that everything that we can know outside of what is definitionally true is gained through experience. It's that synthetic experience, right, that Hume was describing. The second claim you made was that nothing that is a synthetic truth, or rather, no synthetic knowledge can be gained with absolute certainty, because, as we outlined, it's gained through experience. In the last half of the conversation, you guided the conversation a lot more towards like the religious side, right? You made the argument that I believe you made the argument that God is real, but you also talked about Christ resurrecting from the dead, and one way in which you pointed to us being able to know this was through the cataloging of experiences given to us by eyewitnesses.
Sorry, hold on. You just my screen just glitched out. Can you just say that last point again?
Yeah. I can't even see you right now.
I don't know if my internet connection's bad. I'm sorry. Could you just repeat? I can see you again, hear you again. Could you just repeat that last point you just made?
Right. So the last point I made was that you also brought up an argument that you believed God to be real, and not only that, but you believed Christ to have risen from the dead, and one of the ways in which you pointed to being able to have evidence for that was based on the cataloging of experience given to us by eyewitnesses of his resurrection. How do you think? I know this is like a really behemoth of an argument to get into, but do you think how do you think a belief like that can kind of fit itself into into the scope of this conversation.
Right. Well, I mean, I think that if we talk about, I guess it's a tricky thing, right? So there's kind of multiple parts that play into this simultaneously, right? So there's the fundamental recognition that when you're talking about an event like that hasn't been experienced, personally, and we could even talk about whether or not if you experienced an event like that personally, you could even trust that experience. But let's assume that you even could trust your own experience. But you haven't personally experienced it, and even if you were, and we've even talked about how experience itself is such a poor metric for determining knowledge. To claim knowledge, at least in the sense that we've talked about knowledge, about an event like that, when working within the confines that we've established, is impossible. Right? If we kind of move past that and accept that as our fundamental presupposition, and we move into the realm of...
Can you just outline what exactly is the fundamental presupposition, just to be clear?
Yeah, it's the Hume. So there's the fundamental understanding of the kind of the Humean argument that experience, claiming knowledge of an event that is justified by experience is impossible. You can't actually claim knowledge of it, so it falls in the realm of the belief. If we then move it a step further and start talking about, so I guess that's kind of the fundamental presupposition that undergirds everything that we've been talking about, right? If we move further and we start talking about kind of as we were going along this journey of determining truth, or attempting to determine which belief most closely mirrors, and this is kind of, I kind of brought this up in the first, we first started talking about this, but if our goal is to approximate a worldview, a belief system, or even just an individual belief that as closely as possible mirrors what is the actual objective absolute truth, and that's our goal, we fundamentally, with the fundamental recognition that claiming knowledge of those things is impossible, but we are going to start with the presupposition that some beliefs at least may be better or worse than others, and we're going to now attempt to find methods to find out which of those beliefs may be better or worse than others, right? So, and this is the point where, ideas like evidence start to come into play to an extent. So when we're talking about Christ's resurrection, it's a value judgment, but it's also a physical claim, right? When we're talking about physical claims, experience-based evidence is a factor in determining that, in the same way that we would use experience-based evidence to determine whether or not the sun will rise tomorrow. So when I say that the written, documented experience of dozens or even hundreds of people witnessing seeing Christ after his death, fully risen and alive, witnessing that resurrection. And I talk about that being evidence for his resurrection, I mean it in exactly that sense, and nothing else. So take that as you will. That's where it fits into our conversation. I'm not meaning that
specific as to how that would relate to your own personal, direct experience.
Experience of
experience in the Humean sense. How would you be able to gain the ability to believe in something like that? Well, I don't exactly understand your argument, because you're saying these eyewitnesses cataloged his resurrection, but your experience is not then a direct experience of Christ's resurrection. It's an experience of hearing from other people that Christ resurrected.
Right. I'm saying that's a form of evidence. I'm not saying that that's a better form of evidence than my own personal experience, or
Sure.
that but to say that one of those forms of experience is better than the other is a value judgment, and now we're in the realm of
Yes.
value, not of experience,
Exactly.
of evidence to begin with. And so then it becomes that now we're in kind of almost a separate conversation. And so I didn't mean when I say that. That's why when I say that is a form of evidence in that particular context, I mean exactly that and nothing more. I'm not saying that is the best form of evidence or anything like that. I mean exactly what I said and nothing more.
Right.
And nothing less.
And in the same sense, let's say 500 people have an experience with the flying spaghetti monster, offering them free spaghetti for the rest of their life. That would be
a form of evidence for the
yes, that would be a
existence
form of
the flying
evidence.
spaghetti monster.
Now, exactly, but we'd have to be getting into the realm of value if we were to determine that the evidence for Christ's resurrection was more probable than the existence of the flying spaghetti monster, just based on, let's say, 500 eyewitnesses in either case. But you're right. Then we're getting into the realm of value rather than the realm of science.
And the realm of value requires a completely separate form of conversation and debate, and it would be an interesting. I think that for the scope of our conversation right now, that's going to be difficult to get into, but just because that's a whole other beast. But I
think it's pertinent to our conversation, right? Because we're kind of I think we have sufficiently shown why the dichotomy between religion and science is unfounded, in the sense that everything is traceable back to experience, and therefore is not sure and absolute knowledge. However, I'm not sure we have. I think it would be interesting to kind of take the conversation in the direction of, well, no one's going to argue with you that science is something important that should be valued. But I guess the question remaining is whether religion is something important that should be valued, something to be taken seriously.
Well, right. If you consider, and I guess this is the point, if we're setting up a dichotomy between science is the realm of the material and religion is the realm of the value, if you desire to do anything within the realm of the value, you are now dealing within the realm of religion. Period. So because science doesn't deal with that realm at all. So if we desire to have a conversation, and you don't have to call it religion in the institutional sense, but
let's use a different term than religion. Yeah.
Maybe the realm of value. If you're dealing within the realm of the value, then that is a separate conversation than the realm of the material, than the realm of the science. And if you desire to have conversations with other human beings in which you can make things like value claims, which it really, and I would even argue that in order forget about conversations, you can't help but operate in that realm because we operate in the realm of the value. We've already talked about this in previous. You couldn't act if you didn't operate within that realm, right? There's no reason why it is that I should differentiate my desk from my chair if I'm not operating within the realm of the value, because I'm not differentiating those things based on their purely material characteristics. I'm making them based on their use of me, their value to me. And that is a completely separate conversation in the realm of the material or the realm of the science. And so if you desire to be able to act and live, which you do, you necessarily operate within the realm of the value. So that's my answer to that question.
I think it's so necessary to act within the realm of the value. I have a difficulty conceptualizing not acting in the realm of value. I have a difficulty having a conversation where we throw out the realm of value, and I think that's where I was getting a little bit stuck earlier. It's so critical to do anything that you have to establish. I mean, you can't do science without being in the realm of value, because you have to interpret what you're seeing.
Right, and I would even go as far as to say that although I might not be able to evidence in a sort of scientific fashion that the God I believe in actually does exist, and that my faith in him, my belief in him, let's say, is founded, I think logically you are not able to conclude that the experience of a believer in a God is invalid, whereas the experience of someone who is conducting a scientific study is valid simply because it has the word science attached to it.
Right.
So I would even kind of make a little bit of a distinction to add to this. So there's the realm of the natural, right? It's the things that physically exist around us. We've already kind of defined that. Maybe there's the realm of the unnatural, things that don't exist. But there's also possibly the realm of the supernatural, the spiritual experiences, maybe the realm of value as we defined it. It could be from God, it could not be. I'm just defining this as something which we cannot observe with our senses or physically examine, but that might exist.
I have in the same sense of Micah, and I don't entirely disagree with that, but in the same sense of what Micah was just saying, I have a little bit of a difficulty with that distinction, if only because the realm of the material is perceived through the realm of the immaterial. So again, we don't perceive objects, we perceive tools. We perceive things based on their value. And it's just how we interact, how we perceive the world. And so I think
that's a whole separate argument that would go into consciousness. And my argument would be that there is a non-material effect upon consciousness to allow it to make these kind of different judgments as to what things are, right, rather than it just being a material, right, like obviously it's impossible.
Okay, yeah.
Obviously it's impossible for me as a being to interpret what something is or what it means without making some value judgment. Obviously, that's
I understand what you're saying now. I get it.
Right. So it's like if the scientist relies on his evidence and his experience, therefore, to justify his claims about something, that is honorable. That is, like, more power to you. Rely on your experience. But there is also something to the religious claims, I think. If God is calling me to do something something, let's say, noble, something good, and of course those fall very far within the realm of value, and they seem very subjective to listeners probably. But if God is calling me to do something noble and good, that is something that is part of my experience. And I don't think I see a very good argument as to why the experience found within the scientific world is more foolproof than the experience found within religious phenomena.
I'll tell you why it's not. I mean, you just said God calls you to something good and something noble, or something along those lines. And there's a reason he can do that. And that's because he gets to define what those things are. He is operating, in that case, in the realm of value. Science can't define something as being good and noble. Science can only provide evidence that something is one way or another. And by how we interpret that evidence has to be within the realm of value, but that's not information we can get from science, unless it's exclusively functional value. But even that becomes difficult, because you can't just say that because something is how do you say, what do you mean by functional? Well, this thing's more functional than that thing. To what purpose? How do you decide which end? So you can't use the idea of functional value. You can't just be a utilitarian, right? You can't just say we're going to do what makes the most sense and produces the most functional outcome. How do you define a functional outcome without some external source with some external idea of value? And this is actually a very interesting question in terms of how can anyone or anything ever obtain an idea of, you mentioned the perception of reality and how we interact with something. We don't perceive objects, we perceive tools. How could I have ever, I just want to rehash this quickly, because I think it would be a good thing for our listeners to understand a little bit. It's difficult to understand. It's difficult to interpret. You can't interpret the use of something without already having some idea of what that use could be. And poses an interesting question. You start to think about how do babies recognize tools? How does anyone recognize tools?
How does a baby know to eat? You know, it's like,
yeah. I mean, it knows it needs to do something.
I feel like we're almost going in the direction of an entire podcast episode about consciousness.
Well, yeah, that's kind of where I think we're going to have to
go on
because we're starting now to deviate. I think because this is like a really interesting conversation, but we're now getting away from science versus religion.
But I did really want to highlight that point, though.
Yeah,
that we can't only. I don't think it's sufficient for the conversation to only go in the direction of showing that there's this faulty idea of knowledge as being the God that we must submit to. I think there's also the idea that maybe the religious experience is justified, or maybe it isn't, but you have no scientific standard by which to say it either is or isn't.
Right.
It's completely irrelevant when you're looking at it from a scientific perspective.
I think that's 100% correct.
I agree.
Did we want to kind of jump into the next part of the conversation now, which is the religious foundations of science?
I think actually, if we're going to explore the more religious side of what's happened in modern science and since the development of scientific materialism, I think that's a good topic saved for another episode. I think we've waxed poetic about this for a while, and I think we can discuss that next week.
I do want to combine that too, and we mentioned this before the podcast, but I think that would be well combined with the topic of what do we think the Christian response to scientific materialism has gotten wrong, and what do we think that it should be? And I think that would be a very interesting topic to also discuss in our next podcast.
I agree. All right. Well, then I think we'll call that the end of the episode. Thanks, guys.
Thank you, man.
Thanks.
Fun.
You've been listening to another Philosophical Tuesday, a production of the Intellectual Stooges. Thank you for listening, and we hope you'll join us again next Tuesday for another episode.